Hi everyone. This week we are working on chapter 5. So we're talking about early childhood, in particular cognitive development in early childhood. We're thinking about preschoolers this week. And the way preschoolers think is very different than the way you and I think. Pre-operational thinking. When you think about somebody who's, say, 3, 4, or 5 years old, think about the things that you ask them and then their responses and how their responses seem funny to an adult. For example, we're moving in towards the season of Halloween. If you have not been to a big box store lately, then you might not know that. And if you ask a small child, like a 3-year-old, 4-year-old, what do they want to be when they grow up? And they'll say, I want to be Batman, or I want to be a dinosaur. And they're not really thinking about what they want to be when they grow up the way you and I were. Like if I asked you, what do you want to be when you grow up? You might say, I want to be a nurse. I'd like to work in an HR department. I'd like to be an engineer. Whatever it is that you want to be is usually something that's possible. And for them, possible doesn't really matter because it's a different question to them. It isn't that they don't understand the question. They're interpreting it differently. So to them, the question, what do you want to be when you grow up, is what do you want to be right now? Because they don't really have any concept of when I grow up. I mean, they've only been alive for, say, 4 years. And 4 years from now, they'll be 8. So that idea of tomorrow, yesterday, last night, tomorrow night, those are tough concepts for them to think about and try and figure out what it is that you're talking about. You'll find very small children say things like, I did something yesterday in the nighttime. Which makes more sense to them than last night because they don't really know what last night means. Or it takes them a while to figure that out. So they're thinking differently than you and I are. Pre-operational thinking, there are a couple of concepts that you'll encounter in this chapter. One is centration and another is reversibility, or the opposite, irreversibility. And when you're looking through the sections on and watching the videos on conservation tasks, think about how they're centering on one aspect of the task and ignoring all the rest. And I think perhaps next week I've got an assignment for you where I'll give you an example of that, and you also will center on certain things and fail to notice other things. So centration, they're focusing on, say, the level of water in a glass and not the width of the glass. They're centering on one aspect and missing others. The other is irreversibility. With the water pouring task and with many of the conservation tasks, if they can mentally reverse that, they can see that nothing's changed, but they can't. And so what happens is they will watch you pour water back and forth from a short, fat glass to a tall, skinny glass, and the tall, skinny glass always looks like it has more. And when you pour it back, they may acknowledge that it's the same amount of water, but they don't really believe it because mentally they can't really reverse that. They know that that water fits in both places, but they kind of think it's magic. They're not sure how you did it. But they're not completely sure that you didn't do something and fool with them in some way. So if you have small children around, try it out. It can be really fun. What happens sometimes is somebody will say to me, well, I've got a 4-year-old or I've got a 3-year-old and I did it a couple of times and they learned it. Sure, they did learn it, but can they then take that idea of reversibility or decentration and transfer it to another thing? And that's the thing where it gets hard. And that was what Piaget was interested in. When can they first do it with one substance, say for liquid, and then when does that translate into things like understanding clay or stones or other materials? So it doesn't always, just because they get it in one area, it doesn't mean that they get it in another area. Another thing that we'll be talking about this week is theory of mind. It's what makes children terrible liars, which is good, right? We don't want 4 or 5-year-olds to be great liars, but they think that you know what they know. And so when you ask them, well, there are two things going on. One is they think you know. And so if you ask them, how did that cookie get broken or how did that thing happen, they might make something up, but if you stare at them for a minute, they will then sort of come clean because they assume that you know everything that they know. They don't have that concept yet that they could have a secret. The other thing is that they sometimes don't understand what it is that we do know, and so it can go back and forth, but it can be really interesting to talk to small children about the things that they know and whether or not they're able to hold a secret or keep a secret. Over imitation is something that young children engage in. they start to imitate, and they're acting out things that we're doing, but they're not really sure what the relevant parts are. And so they'll do things like pick up a toy and say, this toy isn't working because it doesn't have internet. Well, not all toys have internet, right? But they've heard adults pick up something and say, this doesn't, this phone doesn't work, or this tablet doesn't work because it doesn't have internet. And so they think perhaps not having internet can be the cause of something not working. Another example that I like to use of a preschool child is somebody who will pick up some play item and say, mommy line 1, mommy line 1. And they don't really know what that means. Like, they have no concept of an intercom, or how that all works out, or what's being asked when that comes across the intercom. But they're acting it out, and they're sort of trying to figure out what will happen. So those are things that preschool children are engaging in. There are different kinds of preschools, and so when you're driving around, notice the names of preschools. Some of them say, Academy First, or such and such academy, and that suggests that, and it's appealing to parents, and you can see why, that there's some sort of learning going on. The problem with that, and think about the products that you reviewed last week, is what is it that you want children to be learning at this time? Do you want them to be doing worksheets and trying out rudimentary math problems, or would you rather have them be exploring things and figuring out how things work? And there's some evidence that letting children explore and figure out how things work is a better long-run strategy than trying to push academics really early in life. Doesn't mean there's not a place for it, but it might not be the best thing to have as the main focus. Preschool types, other preschool types that you'll be reading about and that I'll be asking you about, Montessori schools and Reggio Emilia schools have a slightly different focus than an academic, say, preschool, where they're trying to get children to explore things. And in one case, discovery is the motive, and in another case, creativity is the motive. But in both cases, those are child-centered preschools rather than teacher-centered preschools. So that's an important distinction, both as an educator or as a psychologist, and also as a parent, of things that you're thinking about. And then lastly, when it comes to language, children are starting to make mistakes that they didn't make before. They'll say things like, I goed to the store. And what that tells us is not that children are regressing or making mistakes, but that they're learning rules and they're over-applying them. And so we call that over-regularization. They're hearing things in language, and they're starting to see the patterns, but they're not exactly sure when the irregular patterns are and when the regular patterns are. So that can be actually a sign of cognitive development rather than focusing on the mistakes. And then finally, one of the articles if you chose the research article option, there's an article that's posted in the development paper option 2 folder on reading and the reading gap and how that happens, the importance of using language with small children and also reading to them and encouraging early reading. There's an article that I didn't post that's much longer that talks about whether or not we should be teaching reading and asking children to recognize whole words, so the whole language approach, or sounding things out, which is the code-based or the phonics-based approach. And for years there was a debate about which was the best way to teach reading in young children. And that debate has largely been answered on the phonics side. So teaching children to decode sounds and decode parts of words is more helpful in the long run in fostering good reading skills than teaching them to recognize a word on a page and memorize things like in flashcards. If you reviewed the product Your Baby Can Learn, there are a lot of flashcards there. It turns out that that's not the best way to teach reading. It doesn't mean that they don't learn anything from it, but they learn better with a code-based approach. There are a couple of other things to think about when you're thinking about reading, and that is, sure, a code-based approach is good, but they're also going to need some sight words. And so if you have small children who are in pre-K or kindergarten, they may be coming home with flashcards that are called sight words, the, and, very small words. I'll post, if anybody's interested, I can email it to you, but I can post a list of some common sight words that kindergartners might start with. And those are words that occur frequently, that are hard to sound out, and that will help them to develop some pride in their own literacy and their own ability to read a sentence. So the word the, for example, if you sound that out, you're never going to get the word the out of that in the way that you might get cat out of k, a, t. So there's some words that are hard to sound out, and they're also very frequent in our language. And so having some of those connector words will really help students. They learn the word cat and they learn the word hat, and they can sound those out, and they can, if they've got some sight words, they can say the cat in the hat. And then they're proud of themselves because they've learned a sentence. So there you go. That's sort of an intro to this week. I hope you find it interesting. I think how children are learning at this stage is just fascinating. So if you have the opportunity to talk to a preschooler or a kindergartner even, do it. Ask them some questions. Ask them some open-ended questions and just sort of see what they tell you. Sometimes they're a little shy, but once you get them going, it can be really interesting. So have a great week, and I'll talk to you next week with Chapter 6. So we're in early childhood now. This is cognitive development. The next chapter will be psychosocial development, same age. See ya. Bye.